Hello, and welcome to today's Argus Crude podcast brought to you by Argus Media. I am with my colleagues here, Haik Gugarats, editor-at-large in Washington, and London chief economist David Fyfe. We'll be exploring a topic that's very du jour, the broadly discussed but detail elusive G7 price cap proposal on Russian oil. Now, Haik, can you just take us just a little bit through what the outright objectives of this policy are?
Yes, thank you, Ruxandra and David. I look forward to this. In sum, there are two objectives to this. First one is to keep the Russian oil in the market after December 5th, when the EU implements a ban on imports of Russian crude, and at the same time implements a ban on provision of services enabling transportation of Russian crude to third countries. So the goal is to keep those barrels in the market globally, and at the same time, and this is the second objective, to impose a price cap on those exports to third countries, so that Russian revenue from those sales would be well below market rates. To enable that price cap to work, the EU ban on provision of services enabling transportation of Russian oil, will be tweaked to include a caveat, a specific explicit exception that such services can be provided so long as the buyer pays a price at or below the price cap. So that's the twin goal, and we can probably talk about whether it's contradictory or not. But to me, based on the guidance issued by the US Treasury and US Treasury officials' comments, it seems to me that the primary objective is to keep the Russian oil in the market and then ensure that when it's sold below the market rate, because they do talk about a variety of acceptable outcomes, some of which do not necessarily include it being priced at exactly the price cap.
So Haik, I mean, it's David here. Hi to both of you. You know, you talk about this essentially being a G7 proposal. I mean, is it a cert that the entirety of the G7, and for that matter, the European Union, are on board for this, politically speaking?
They are on board at the top leaders level. The leaders of G7 countries, when they met this July, approved it, gave the idea the go ahead. The finance ministers of G7 approved basic proposals. You know, I'm going to roll back the tape. Hopefully, the recording will catch up. The G7 leaders approved this idea at the level of principles back in July. The finance ministers of G7 met just in the beginning of September to approve the specific framework on which it is going to be based. So yes, you can say that there is a G7 approval. However, it does require EU to act, because EU is implementing this ban on services. It's going into effect in December. And for it to be changed, it would require a unanimous decision by all EU members. And we all remember how long it took for the European Commission to agree to the so-called sixth package back in May and June. And it included a lot of horse trading, for lack of a better term. It included a specific carve-out, for example, for pipeline imports into the EU. So we would probably expect a similar process, but at the political level, at the level of leadership, there is an agreement that something like this has to be implemented along those lines we just discussed.
So that's kind of how the policy is set out, but can you give us a little bit of detail about what exactly it comprises? What do we know about the actual price level? What do we know about support for it, for the deal?
Those details, interestingly enough, are still not finalized, although we are less than 3 months from the implementation date being December 5th. And so, first of all, the price cap is going to be fixed. It's not going to be tied to a benchmark. It's not indexed. It's a fixed number. And what we know about the crude price cap, and I'm stressing crude because there will be separate price caps for refined products. Two separate ones, roughly speaking, divided between heavy and light products, but that is yet to be determined which products. The crude price cap will be no lower than the Russian cost of production. And the Russian cost of production is referenced in actually the Russian federal budget at $44 and some change per barrel. So we know that it's not going to be lower than that price. Then, of course, oil never trades at cost, even in principle. So there is some freight cost add-on. There are some other technical factors to be added, but so far those have not been finalized. So we know how the price cap works in theory. We know, at least for crude, the lower bound of it, but we don't actually know what the price cap level will be. We know that it will be fixed. It may differ from region to region, and it will be adjusted as time goes on. So the basic idea is to provide an incentive for Russia to cooperate. So if it's set less than the production cost, Russia would not cooperate, obviously. So there is presumably a carrot there for continued sales by Russia. But of course, that is the basic assumption of the entire price cap plan, that Russia will cooperate, even though Russian President Putin threatened to withhold crude from any buyer who supports the price cap. And it's a threat that seemingly is backed by a parallel Russian retaliation on gas markets. So my question, actually, if I may, to you, David, how seriously should we view this rationality assumption, and what would you think Moscow will do?
No, that's a very good question. And, as you say, we've had statements both from Minister Novak and President Putin himself, who's saying, look, if you adhere or you go along with this G7 price cap plan, then we're simply not going to sell oil to you. Now, the sort of rational actor assumption would say, well, Russia will keep selling oil. Now, why is that? Why do we say that? Last year, oil export revenues alone were worth about 180 billion to Russia in 2021. Now, if you look at their total export revenues for everything, oil's about 40% of total export revenues. Gas is about 10%. So arguably the economic hit that Russia takes from withholding gas supplies is considerably less than the hit they would take if they stopped selling oil into the market. So just from an economic pain standpoint, you tend to think if Russia's going to be rational about this, they're going to be a lot less keen to withhold oil supplies to the market than gas supplies for that reason. The second sort of rational actor criterion is one that's really tied in, A, to the sort of lack of storage capacity onshore that Russia has, and therefore, if they're not exporting it, what are they going to do with it? They don't have much storage capacity, and that's going to be a constraint on them cutting off exports, and that then would lead to the supposition that they'd have to cut wellhead production. And of course, once you get into that territory, then you're looking at potential damage to reservoirs or reservoir pressure degradation and so on. So that's the sort of rational actor view that says, no, Russia will actually, they're bluffing, and actually they'll carry on exporting oil. But of course, the big issue here is, how rational will Russia be as the Ukraine crisis rumbles on and the conflict rumbles on? you know, and that's impossible to say at this stage. I suppose the question I would pose is, we've also got to think about another group of producers who may respond to this price cap issue, which is OPEC plus. Russia's part of OPEC plus. You know, how willing are the rest of OPEC going to be if we're going to see, you know, what, 1 to 2 million barrels per day of Russian exports diverted out of Europe and potentially sold into Asia at discounted prices? How does that look from other members of OPEC? Ruxandra, what do you think of that?
Well, first off, I'll throw this back at you for 1 second and say, do you think that Asia can really absorb everything that Russia has to send?
No, I mean, you know, our working assumption, or the assumption of Argus Consulting, really since the crisis began, you know, Europe last year bought about 3.5 million barrels per day of crude and products from Russia. Our working assumption, with no real detailed insight on the logistics of it, has been that maybe 1.5 to 2.5 million barrels per day of that 3.5 can be diverted to Asia, leaving you know, sort of 1 to 2 million barrels per day that potentially might be lost to the market. So what we're saying is, yeah, between 1.5 and 2.5 million barrels per day potentially gets diverted to Asia. And certainly we've seen extra crude going into China and India already. So really the question there is, you know, how do other OPEC producers view this prospect, you know, potentially losing a slug of their market to discounted Russian barrels?
But even, you know, as you're saying, even if it's not the full volume of Russian exports that gets diverted, even if it's just a fractional volume of supply, that's still a considerable chunk of crude that would be technically diverted towards what is classically a very Middle Gulf producer market. Now, the interesting thing is that Russian crude would not be selling on the same kind of terms as Middle Gulf producers tend to position their barrels. Those tend to be done on term arrangements with term customers. You buy your annual crude supply volume, and you know a year ahead what your requirement is going to be for the year incoming. And actually, we've seen Iraq basically make the same argument by saying, look, we know India has been purchasing quite a lot of Russian crude on a spot basis, but we are still very secure in India, where they are typically leading supplier, because we know that they will also be separately prioritizing their term agreements. So in that sense, it isn't a like for like comparison between Russian crude and OPEC crude. OPEC as an organization has typically always valued the sanctity of the alliance above individual temporary gains. The question that becomes that comes in is whether they would be able to accommodate Russia in this particular market that has been a safe haven of growth for so many of them, especially Saudi Arabia, which, you know, alongside Russia is de facto leader of the OPEC plus group. So it'll be, I think, as we approach the period when consumers have to define their term requirements for 2023, as we also approach the same deadline for when Europe phases out Russian crude, I think it will be very interesting to see how many buyers decide to lower their intake of term crude in favor of opening up more requirements on a spot basis and taking Russian crude. So I guess obviously we have Russia and OPEC and the G7, and everyone is looking at the big buyers. We're talking India, we're talking China, and they're all asking themselves the same thing, which is the same question that I just asked. How will these buyers react? Will they step in to buy more? Will they decide that for political merits or for logistical merits, they can only take so much?
And if I can add to that, there is also a rationality assumption on the part of this plan that the buyers see a clear advantage to them in participating. And of course, that assumption will be put to test. But I mentioned earlier, there is a variety of acceptable outcomes to this plan, at least as far as the United States government is concerned. We have senior Treasury officials saying, look, even if not every country joins the price cap, if in fact, if most buyers do not, but they negotiate deals with Russia and use the price cap as leverage. From the US perspective, that's still a win. So you will probably see a press release, highlighting that, in January, if it turns out that India or China buys discounted Russian oil, that would still be considered a win. So that may or may not have come as a result of the price cap. And of course, we know that a lot of those buyers are already buying discounted oil. But just in terms of communication as to the objectives of this plan, I think there is a great degree of acknowledgement on the part of the Treasury, on the part of the sanctions authorities, that it's quite possible that many will not join the price cap, but so long as they negotiate below market deals with Russia, that is viewed as a victory, at least from Washington. And of course, everything here hinges on whether market participants themselves comply. This isn't sanctions, right? This isn't sanctions in a sense that Iran and Venezuela sanctions regimes were applied. The Treasury guidance that came on September 9th includes two words that are critical for any sanction lawyer: safe harbor, which means limits to sanctions liability, at least for the providers of insurance, reinsurance, and financial services. Any party that doesn't exactly know the price but is underwriting a contract, all they have to do is attest that their clients told them that the price was right. So I'm sure a lot of sanctions lawyers along the line of trade of oil will be looking at this, but at least the message that we are hearing from Washington, from the Treasury, is one of reassurance that it's okay to participate in this term. Yes, the price cap has to be obeyed, and insurers have to do their due diligence, but they are not going to be held liable so long as their clients told them that they obeyed the price cap. So that's a communication exercise. We will probably see more and more of this, and of course, the Treasury may be saying one thing. They know they have to reassure every market participant about what it is that they are trying to do. And we will see a lot more of this guidance coming in the next couple of months. We have talked at least two angles behind this price cap plan. We talked about Russia's participation. We've talked about the market reaction and the reaction of other producers. But I wonder, David, what else is happening potentially that could affect this plan, whether it's oil market specific or more broad?
Yeah, well, I think you've highlighted the sort of dual thrust of this policy, or the dual aims of the policy. First of all, not necessarily in order, but cutting Russian revenues, but also ensuring that barrels continue to flow to the market despite the European embargo, and therefore limiting the sort of upward trajectory of prices potentially when the European sixth package of sanctions comes in at the end of this year and early next year. Of course, that may well be coinciding, and it looks increasingly likely that it could coincide with a fairly major slowdown in the global economy. And in fact, depending on the economic forecaster that you ask about this, there's a sizable number of estimates out there now that says, actually, in the first half of 2023, we're potentially looking at Europe essentially entering recession after, with the levels of natural gas prices that we're seeing in Europe, and therefore electricity prices. Europe's likely to be in recession over the course of the winter. And, with the pace at which the Federal Reserve is raising interest rates, there's also a school of thought that sees, at least on a sort of relatively short-term basis, around the turn of the year, the US itself could well be in recession. And so we confront a price cap that, in a sense, could be rendered redundant if we see outright economic recession and a weakening of oil demand, which actually itself allows oil prices to drop to a certain extent. So that's something that, I doubt very much that the G7 members would be wishing for that to happen. But we need to look at the macroeconomic situation, which frankly is looking pretty precarious at the present time.
Absolutely. Thank you, David, and thank you, Ruxandra, and thank you to our listeners for tuning into the Argus Crude podcast for this topic and many other topics about oil markets. Check out our many publications, starting with Argus Global Markets, Petroleum Argus, Argus China Petroleum, and many others. Thank you, and we'll talk to you again soon.